Hi, today we are having our third lesson, which is about state sovereignty, and it's mainly about how Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, enlightened the Western political theory by conceptualizing the very term Leviathan. Before that, a little bit context would be useful in recognizing and understanding who Hobbes is and what Hobbes did. Thomas Hobbes was a man who lived with fear. In his autobiography, Hobbes recounted that on the day of his birth in 1588, his mother learned that Spanish armada had set sail to attack England. This news so terrified Hobbes' mother that she went into labor prematurely. And thus writes Hobbes, "Fear and I were born twins together." Fear is a significant theme in Hobbes' writing, restructuring both his written accounts of his life and the Hobbesian philosophical system. Leviathan, the book we are discussing today, is Hobbes' most important work and one of the most influential philosophical texts in the history of Western political theory. And it was a text which was produced during the 17th century, and it was written partly as a response to the fear Hobbes experienced during the political turmoil of the English Civil War, which was a series of armed conflicts and political machinations between parliamentarians, which are known as Roundheads, and royalists, which are known as Cavaliers. And principally, the manner of English government was a response to conflict between these two sectarians. In the 1640s, it was clear to Hobbes that Parliament was going to turn against King Charles I, so he fled to France for 11 years, terrified that, as a royalist, he would be persecuted for his support of the king. Hobbes composed Leviathan while in France. The book was finally published in 1651, 2 years after Parliament ordered the beheading of Charles I and took over administration of the English nation in the name of the Commonwealth. Leviathan rigorously argues that civil peace and social unity are best achieved by the establishment of a commonwealth. By the way, commonwealth is a metaphor for the state. The Leviathan is described as an artificial person whose body is made up of all the bodies of his citizens, who are the literal members of the Leviathan's body. And Hobbes' ideal commonwealth is ruled by a sovereign power responsible for protecting the security of the commonwealth and granted absolute authority to ensure the common defiance. Hobbes describes the Commonwealth as an artificial person and as a body politic that mimics the human body. The frontispiece to the first edition of Leviathan, which Hobbes helped design, portrays the Commonwealth as a gigantic human form built out of the bodies of its citizens, the sovereign as its head. Hobbes calls this figure the Leviathan, a word derived from the Hebrew for sea monster and the name of a monstrous sea creature appearing in the Bible. The image constitutes the definitive metaphor for Hobbes' perfect government. His text attempts to prove the necessity of the Leviathan for preserving peace and preventing civil war. A giant crowned figure is seen emerging from the landscape, clutching a sword and a crosier, beneath a quote from the Book of Job. I am quoting, "There is no power on earth to be compared to him," linking the figure to the monster of that book. The torso and arms of the figure are composed over 300 persons. All are facing inwards, with just the giant's head having visible features. The body is also composed of many faces, all looking outwards from the body and with a range of other expressions. The roots of Leviathan are not in God, but in man. He moved politics from God to earth. The sword represents security because it is vital to society. For Hobbes, state of nature is hell. By the way, by the state of nature, Hobbes refers to a nasty, brutish, and short human life, which is seen or which is experienced like hell. And for Hobbes, God is finite. Crosier that he is holding represents enlightenment or the enlightened man, the despot. Individuals do matter in Hobbes because they need to exist. They have to have a common body, the body of the sovereign. Hobbes was against the Middle Ages and thus feudalism. He was in disagreement with the Church because the Church represented the ideology of the Middle Ages. Hobbes is in between Renaissance and Enlightenment. By the way, Renaissance was a period in European history, from the 14th to the 17th century, regarded as the cultural bridge between the Middle Ages and modern history. It started as a cultural movement in Italy in the late medieval period and later spread to the rest of Europe, marking the beginning of the early modern ages. In Hobbes' time, capitalism managed to erase feudalism from the history, but feudal men were still around, and they are still around. Hobbes begins his treatise on politics with an account of human nature. He presents in an image of man as matter always in motion, attempting to show through example how everything about humanity can be explained materialistically. The philosophy of materialism states that physical matter and its motion explain all phenomena in the universe and construct the only reality that human beings can experience. Hobbes proceeds by defining terms clearly and in an unsentimental way. Good and evil are nothing more than terms used to denote an individual's appetites and desires, while these appetites and desires are nothing more than the tendency to move toward away from an object. Hope is nothing more than an appetite for a thing combined with opinion that it can be had. He suggests that the dominant political theology of the time, scholasticism, thrives on confused definitions of everyday words, such as incorporeal substance, which for Hobbes is a contradiction in terms. By the way, scholasticism is a system of theology and philosophy taught in medieval European universities based on Aristotelian logic that we discussed last week, and the writings of the early Christian fathers, and emphasizing narrow-minded insistence on traditional doctrines and dogmas. Hobbes describes human psychology without any reference to the summum bonum, or the greatest good. So the summum bonum refers to the greatest good in Hobbes' philosophical understanding. Not only is the concept of summum bonum superfluous, but given the variability of human desires, there could be no such thing. Consequently, any political community that sought to provide the greatest good to its members, to its citizens, would find itself driven by competing conceptions of that good with no way to decide among them, and the result would be civil war. There is, however, as Hobbes states, also a summum malum, or the greatest evil. So we have in Thomas Hobbes two concepts about the greatest good and the greatest evil. The first one is summum bonum, which is the greatest good, and the second one is the summum malum, which is the greatest evil. This is the fear of violent death. A political community, according to Hobbes, can be oriented around this fear. Since there is no summum bonum, the natural state of man is not to be found in a political community that pursues the greatest good. But to be outside of a political community is to be in anarchic conditions. Given human nature, the variability of human desires and need for scarce resources to fulfill those desires, the state of nature, as Hobbes calls this anarchic condition, must be a war of all against all. Even when two men are not fighting, there is no guarantee that the other will not try to kill him for his property or just out of an aggrieved sense of honor, so they must constantly be on guard against one another. It is even reasonable to preemptively attack one's neighbor. The desire to avoid the state of nature as the place where the summum bonum of violent death is most likely to occur forms the polyester of political reasoning in Hobbes. It suggests an absolute sovereign. But who or what is the sovereign according to Hobbes? There are two ways of identifying the sovereign. The sovereign in a society is a person or body of persons who, first, has been given the right of governing through the social contract, and second, has the three marks of sovereignty, namely control of the military, ability to raise money, and control of religious doctrines. In this sense, Hobbes' idea of sovereignty, or Leviathan, is an absolutist in the sense that there is no right to revolution or rebellion on ideological grounds. There are rights to violently resist the state in order to save one's own life, but no one has the right to overthrow the sovereign and install a new one, or to change the form of the state from, say, monarchy or aristocracy. By denying the legitimacy of using nature as the foundation of philosophical knowledge, Hobbes issues a direct challenge to natural philosophy as conceived of by Francis Bacon. According to Bacon, natural philosophy should be based on an experimental natural science grounded in natural history. However, Hobbes suggests that nature does not provide secure first principles, and therefore a science grounded in language rather than nature is more adequate, or making incontrovertible claims. Hobbes' philosophy makes the radical claim that truth is a social construction and argues that its own conclusions are correct precisely because they too are socially constructed. When everyone has agreed upon the foundation of knowledge, there is no room for dispute. In contrast, there can be no truth based on an objective nature, for each individual experiences the world differently, and thus the configuration of reality is subject to inevitable disagreement and debate. For Hobbes, therefore, eliminating disagreement is essential to eliminating the conditions for civil war. Peace is the ultimate purpose of this philosophical program, entirely grounded in social consent. At the same time, Hobbes' notion of reality as a social construction contains a certain element of totalitarianism. And this is the place where the critiques against Hobbes are to be explained. His notion of an all-powerful judge of definitions, making decisions that cannot be disputed, resembles totalitarian philosophy. It advocates the control of reality through power negotiations, but accepts completely the powerlessness of the individual to change that constructed reality. To summarize the main points, Hobbes' main text, Leviathan, was written as a response to the fear Hobbes experienced during the English Civil War. Leviathan was mainly advocating a strong and absolutist sovereignty which is based on science and which is based on violent death. But of course, this leads to criticism against against Thomas Hobbes, because Hobbes' notion of reality as a social construction, according to the critiques, contains a certain element of totalitarianism. It leaves no room for antagonism and conflict, and his notion of an all-powerful judge of definitions, making decisions that cannot be disputed, resembles a totalitarian philosophy and a totalitarian and absolutist idea of sovereignty. Since Hobbes advocates the control of reality through power negotiations, he also at the same time accepts a very powerless individual to change that construct that reality. Next week, we will continue the discussion of sovereignty by emphasizing the importance of Carl Schmitt, the German jurist.